Hi, everyone. Welcome inside the Astro Studio, a show where I interview astrologers about their path and their methods to give people who love astrology a peek behind the scenes into the process of the experts of our industry. I'm your host, Sarah Al-Harar, and today I'm talking to one of my most esteemed teachers, Mr. Sam Reynolds.
Hey, Sarah.
Sam has been a professional astrologer and teacher for decades. I wrote 25 question mark, 30 question mark. Is that about right?
It's over 30 years, yeah.
Over 30 years.
Hmm.
But he came into this world as a skeptic. And so we're going to talk about that in a minute. But since then, Sam has become one of one of astrology's favorite teachers, really. In the astrologer circles, people often refer to you as, one of our favorite teachers. You've spoken at many conferences, including NORWAC and ESAR, where I've heard you speak. You serve as the president of the board of directors for the IAA. Is that still right?
That is not true anymore.
That is not true anymore.
No, yeah, it's a recent change, so don't feel bad. I mean, the IA was sold and its board dissolved in June.
Oh,
So
has it dissolved into OPA now? Is that right?
no, 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 no.
No, that's
It's been sold to Luke Bailey, who's an Australian astrologer. And he's going to keep IAA as, the name and everything else
yeah.
and its curriculum, but they dissolved the board, so I'm no longer the president.
Amazing. But you're now the president of a new organization,
That's
right?
correct.
That you've created, which is called so I want to say IK when I read it like that. But is it Ikai? But
No,
it's
we just say ICAE.
ICAE, Ikai, IK. It's
I
it's gonna
like
be
it.
like the
EK
same
though.
deep
Like I'm gonna tell that to the group.
EK. It's gonna be the same debate as ISAR and
And
ESAR
ESAR,
forever,
right.
right? And
Yeah.
it's the International Coalition of Astrology Educators. I love the name coalition. First of all, kudos on that. It's
Thank you.
great. Um, and so for those of you who don't know Samuel's work, you can of course check out his website, unlockastrology.com. Samuel, thank you so much for being here with me today. I'm so grateful for you and your presence. And so
And
let's
thank you for
start. Yeah.
having me.
It's always a pleasure to be together and to talk. And before we started recording, we just started talking as we do, as we would. And then I'm like, okay, no, 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 stop, stop. Don't say anymore. I have to start recording and keep the gems to be on the recording because you drop gems. You're a truth bomb dropper. So
One way to put it. Yeah.
I'm so happy you're here. Let's start at the beginning. I know you're from Buffalo. Were you born in Buffalo, New
I
York?
was born in Buffalo, yes.
Born in Buffalo, you come from like a practicing Christian family,
Yes.
Baptist question mark. Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
And so you were like a little boy wonder minister
Yeah, I
kid.
went into the ministry when I was 12. I felt a calling to go into the ministry. Um, my family, because of enduring different physical problems, mainly from birth defects, they had a mythology, that isn't uncommon in many Black homes or even Christian homes of any kind of stripe or race. Um, that this all must be for a reason, and so God must have a special purpose for me, which I didn't fully accept, and you can argue I don't fully accept now, but um, I I guess I came to a crisis point around 12 years old and felt like my soul needed saving, even though I had at that time recently embraced atheism, which is a whole other conversation for us to have. But
Yeah.
I had embraced atheism and then, but had this crisis myself and felt a need to kind of turn to Christ and a full, it wasn't even like a physical crisis. I wasn't in jeopardy. I can explain that, but I'll just give the shortened version just right off. And then I went into the ministry when on my mother's birthday in 1980, preached my first sermon, and I stayed in the ministry for 7 years until I felt like I had more questions than answers, and I stepped away.
It's very
But
young to have such an existential crisis.
well, let me tell you, it's even funnier when I tell you why I kind of had it. So even though I had embraced, temporarily atheism, just as recent as that, like spring of 1980. So it was really fresh. And I just was like, well, there probably is no God. You could say that was more agnosticism, but it was kind of a fine line. But I went to camp, summer camp, and there was a camp counselor who was a Christian, and he had a comic book, Jack T. Chick comic books. If people are familiar with those comics, they're comics. And there was one called "This Is Your Life," where supposedly at the end of your life, you're called to heaven, and you're judged by both your actions and your thoughts. So when I read that, I was like, oh, snap. Because I felt like any true Scorpio sun, like I've had some really dark thoughts. But the thought that I was most ashamed of, that I didn't want seen in heaven, was the one I had when I was 6 years old. When I was 6 years old,
Hmm.
I envisioned that God was I didn't have the language for it, but God was some kind of renegade from another dimension that got booted out and then started his own cosmos. But I even felt shame in that moment, even though one can acknowledge now it was just a Gnostic idea.
Right.
But I felt shame in that moment. And the thought that that would be revealed was the crisis.
Oh, it's very cute.
It's a
But
ninth house, it's very ninth house. So it's kind of like,
and you
yeah,
tell a
kid,
Scorpio like your thoughts. You
right.
tell that Scorpios are like, no, not that. Like that's
Not
the
that. It
only
wasn't
privacy I have in the world.
right. And it wasn't even, in retrospect, because I'm 50, almost 57 now. In retrospect, looking at it like, yeah, kid, you needed to lighten up. That wasn't really that serious. As
It's
versus like
heavy.
someone like, oh yeah, I pushed out my sister down the steps, or I thought about, you know, I guess tripping my father or whatever. It wasn't that. It was just like, oh, God's just a renegade.
So funny. And so tell me something, as like a minister, when you're a kid, like do people come to you for advice or like you do sermons and whatever, like so public speaking already, but do people come to their minister? Like what's the role of a minister in a community? I don't
Yeah.
even know.
So one of the things that, first let me say this, because I know this is still an extant tradition, that I'm very against this tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because it puts a lot of pressure on a young person in seeking to have proof of concept for God, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that's really kind of what's happening. We may not want to frame it that way, but that is kind of the way it happens. And so, to your question, there's this reverence, because I was Reverend Samuel F. Reynolds. There's this reverence that becomes attached to a kid who's barely lived, right? Which comes concomitant with this idea that I'm tapped into this ancient wisdom by virtue of the primacy of my youth. And so, with that, my understanding of scripture, being able to preach, and then, like you asked, related to counseling, I have people who were 3 times my age asking me, about their marriage. And, like, I hadn't even gotten laid. Well, I had, but I mean, I hadn't even gotten,
Yeah,
in a deep relationship.
any life. You
Right.
hadn't gotten life.
So, and I felt comfortable to some degree by virtue of being buttressed by scripture and calling, that I could levy some measure of advice, even though like there would be moments, fleeting moments of doubt that I probably should have had more often. But I didn't initially, for the good, 6 years of my ministry. It was only toward the seventh year where, it's kind of like, why am I doing this? Or what about this and that? But yeah, so people did
Wow.
come to me for that. And it was a lot of pressure, um, you know, and kind of juggling being a kid with also, this expectation. The Shining came out, everyone was talking about red rum as an example, if people
Mm-hmm.
remember The Shining,
Okay.
which backwards means murder. And I was a kid, and I'm not excusing it completely, but I was on a bike, maybe with a friend at 9 o'clock at night, just before we're going in. And I was just screaming, red rum, red rum. And this one other kid, she stopped me in my tracks when she said hypocrite. And I was like,
Yeah.
why? Because you're like, you come and preach and then now you're screaming red rum. And the dissonance didn't really occur to me, because you're just like being a kid and doing stupid stuff, right? And yeah, we could look at it as stupid, but at the same time, there was this expectation that you're a serious man of God.
But
And I
it was
wasn't even
put
a
around,
man.
it was put on you when, I mean, like it's circumstantial too. I mean, people are giving you this thing that wasn't meant to be, or was it? And I mean, you know what I mean? Or was it dot, dot, dot? Because you're also like, oh, look, now you're Sam Reynolds.
Right.
So, I mean, it's like far from the church, but is it question mark? Like, how
Is what
far
far
is
from the
it?
church being an astrologer?
Yeah, how far really is it? Like if you consider actual distance from other things, like it's not that far. Just take a little left turn and go around
Well,
a little
yeah,
bit.
to your point, the joke I make now is that I felt a calling to the ministry, but the joke I make is like, well, it's not like Spirit said what to what. Like I
Yeah,
went toward Christianity because that's what I knew, but the calling wasn't
exactly.
necessarily like to become a Christian and to become a minister per se.
No, you were already a kid who was having like big thoughts about like divinity and what it means to be responsible in community and what it means to channel thought and what it means to read scripture, to understand text, to it's like, yeah, kids scream red rum. They don't think about those things. You know what I mean?
No.
So I don't know if it's hypocrisy or just like shit, like the heavy duty, like the burden of, yeah, it sounds like heavy. Now that I
And
think
it
about
wasn't
it,
it
it's
was
like,
another kid. It was another kid who was
right.
slightly older, maybe even my age. So I'm
But
sure
she
she
called
would
out
approach it.
something real though. She saw it. She was
She
like,
saw it, right.
"Mhm."
But at the same time, I wonder, and
Hypocrite was not the right word.
it wasn't the right word, but it was the right sentiment in the sense
Right.
that,
It was like,
like
she's like, oh,
there's
dichotomy.
there's a dichotomy here. And, and she
Mhm.
was in a wheelchair having, I think, broken her leg. She wasn't,
Right.
permanently disabled, but so I think maybe she also felt like she needed hope. I don't know what she was going through completely. Um,
Wow.
but that
Yeah.
maybe she might even, if I saw her or she could, met me, she might, I don't know, apologize or realize like, well, that's not where I really meant to go. But
Hmm.
she may have just been expressing her frustration.
Mm. And so did you know you were a Scorpio at that moment? Did you have any language around
Well,
that or?
that's interesting because so my astrology had always been in my periphery from my parents had a cutting board or cutting
Mhm.
thing inlaid. It was the 70s, and so they had a zodiac. So I grew up with that. Um, they also had what we call dream books, and in it they had breakdowns of the different signs. But I was always confused because I'm on the quote unquote cusp. So some of the books would say that I was a Scorpio, and some would say I was a Sagittarius. And when I read the breakdowns for Scorpio, they never seemed to be exact. And it was complicated because I had a brother, older brother, who was at the beginning of Scorpio. Like he's 0 degrees Scorpio, and I'm 29 degrees Scorpio. And he seemed to fit more the idea of what I read about Scorpio than what I saw about, from the others. But I then when I became a minister, I, preached against astrology and the zodiac because that's also what fundamentalists subscribe to. So people would ask me, like, well, what sign are you? And I would say, I'm the sign of the cross,
Mhm.
right? I just wouldn't answer. Partly it was tongue in cheek because I'm like, well, I'm this cusp thing, but also I'm a Christian and I want to kind of get into a conversation about the zodiac.
Mhm.
Um, But then because of that confusion I had kind of declared astrology bunk. And I was like, it
Mhm.
probably doesn't make any sense. It's the Barnum effect. Other things I learned later that made me question its validity.
Mhm. And so, okay, so you're like, nah, whatever. So it's not even in your when you dismiss something as uninteresting, it's not even like in your realm. So how did it happen? Like, what's your trigger moment? Like, who broke you, Sam?
Who broke me?
Who broke you?
A Gemini. A Gemini broke me. So so I left the ministry roughly around 19, or stopped being, doing the work of a minister. I hadn't left Christianity. That came later. Um, and I went to graduate school for what I was pursuing, my master's and PhD in African American studies. So my focus shifted to looking at race, gender, and class. Um, I wasn't as interested in metaphysics, even though I was still friendly to the intuitive, more tarot, meditation, other kinds of things, but definitely not astrology, because astrology didn't make any sense to me. Um, so that stayed. But during I did an ethnographic study at a Social Security office. I was a project, and I met uh an older Gemini woman. I say older, I mean at least 20 years older.
What was her name?
Um, her first name is Geneva. I don't remember her last name. She's kind of lost to
Geneva the
history for me.
Gemini.
Yeah,
Great.
lost to history. I wish I could find her and thank her. But anyway, I developed a crush on her and thought I could, get with her. But she was kind enough, and I would say it now that way, that she befriended me without encouraging that, you know, that lust or whatever. So we would hang out, have dinner and different things. And she was into astrology. And she was like, well, I think you're a Scorpio, after getting to know me a little more. And I was like, well, if I have to choose between the arachnid and the centaur, clearly I'm a centaur,
Of course.
right? Right. I mean, like, why would I be the bug? And she's like, no, I think you're the bug. And my interest in metaphysics hadn't completely waned. So I was also interested in magic, just curious. And so there was a particular magical text that's called the six, seven, eighth books of Moses. That's more apocryphal. It's not even completely, necessarily real. Um, I was looking for that book, and this is before Amazon. So this is 1991, 92, 91. And I called around the city in Philadelphia because I was going to Temple University. I called around the city to try to find this book, and I found it at this small bookshop that also doubled as a store, as also doubled as a place where you could do the lottery, in North Philadelphia, owned by a black man, Kofi. And I went there, and he was talking to me. I guess I, I don't know, maybe I thought it was a kindred soul or whatever. I just wanted to get the book. And he was like, well, do you know your astrology? No. And he's like, well, you ever thought about getting your chart done? Not really. Well, I mean, I could do your chart for you. I mean, it would cost this much, and you just bring 2 cassette tapes. Then the light bulb went on, and I was like, oh, I could shut up the Gemini and solve this conundrum about whether I'm a Scorpio or a Sagittarius. And I was like, okay. So I got the session with him, and I still have the chart. It was a big uh circle that he had done. He drew it by hand. This is before we had, technology and computers to kind of do it quickly for us. And within the first 15 minutes, I was already dissuaded that this was, or persuaded to think this was bunk, because he said, well, you're a Scorpio sun. I was like, oh, this is already shite. And I was like, yeah, sure. And he went on and he said, well, seems like you're a pretty bright guy. And, I just kept that impervious face because I was like, well, I told you I was in graduate school. Chances are I'm
Hmm.
not an idiot. So like this is not going beyond the pale of guesswork. And you've met me, I'm short in person. So he was like, well, it looks like you may have had some challenges in your youth, or maybe in utero. Yeah, I mean, I'm 4 feet, maybe at that time, 4 feet 9. So I'm statistically anomalous for a black man. So yeah, that's not, again, I'm not saying this aloud, but I'm just kind of looking at him and I'm like, okay, is this it? This is astrology? But then after that 15 minutes, he started going more into the chart and got it, talking very casually about it. And he says it. He says the thing. The thing is, he said, well, it looks like there's some kind of complication between, or issue, like an argument between your mother, looks like your brother, and your father while you were in utero that may have complicated your pregnancy.
Mhm.
And that's when I kind of broke my facade and was like, how do you know that? Because that was exactly true. And I was like, how do you know that? And he's like, oh, we got all avuncular about it. It's right here. You look at your Mercury moon square, which is a wide square. It's 2 degrees Leo moon to 11 degrees Mercury in Scorpio. So I'm just like, now not even
You
something
don't
I would,
even know orbs then, so
right.
you're
But
sure.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But, now I can look at it, I'm like, that's not even what I would do now.
Right,
But
but
he looked
hey,
at,
that's a big thing. Like the method doesn't matter. Astrologers get to the point, no
you're
matter.
right. You're, absolutely, because
Kofi.
what I've thought about in retrospect is, if he hadn't done that, and if this is kind of the work of spirit or providence, of however you want to look at it, nothing else he would have said would have reached me as that reached me. Like, he could have gone on, and I did see him, twice or three times um after that. Nothing he said after that was as compelling as that, because that was the moment, speaking of being broken, where he broke me, because I was just like, how do you know that? Like, I had gone to other readers before, mainly on a lark. I wasn't looking for, I'm kind of more of an anthropologist in some sense. I wasn't looking for particular answers. I was just collecting data, like, how do you do what you do? Because I actually think it's bullshit, but I really want to know, like, what parameters of bullshit is this? Like, I want to get the contours of it.
Yeah.
And most times I felt that way.
What
Like,
parameters of bullshit is this? Is my favorite quote of the year. That's
so I just wanted to see, like,
yeah.
what it was. And um and not all readers, not all readings, like, I have found going to a Babalao, in terms of the Yoruba tradition, very compelling and powerful. But most other times I felt like, going to parlor psychics or other folks like that, I was like, yeah, okay, tell me something new, chief. Um, but this was specific. And I was
Precise.
like, how do you know that? So then it gets better or worse, depending on how you want to take it. So I was living in graduate housing at Temple. And for some reason, I can't remember, I was talking to someone who was pretty much a stranger to me, not in my department, not, and I was talking to her maybe in the hallway about my experience of seeing the astrologer. And I still don't know why I was doing that. And she said, well, I'm into astrology. I'm like, oh, okay. Maybe you could tell me a little more, because I don't make sense of it. Then again, on a lark, I say to her, well, when's your birthday? November 22nd. November 22nd when? November 22nd, 1967. That's my exact birthday. And I was like, that's that's my birthday. Well, that's my birthday. And I'm like, that's weird. And I had enough respect for coinkydinks that I was just like, maybe this is going beyond the pale of coinkydink. So I was like, well, you have astrology books. Could I borrow them sometime? And she lent them to me. And I started reading them. And then that, I won't say the rest is history. I guess it was just me reading them coupled with learning more, all with the effort to debunk astrology. I mean, I kept waiting, as I would do readings for people. It wasn't with the effort of like, oh, this is wonderful, but it was always, I was waiting for the moment for one of my friends, because it mainly was my friends, going like, that doesn't make sense. That's not what happened, or that's not my life. It would be just the opposite. Oh yeah, that's spot on. That's exactly what I feel. Blah. And I was like, this, why does this make sense? How does this work? And then I got an astrology program, because I had a Mac, and it come out with a program. So I started doing charts, and again, kept doing it, and doing readings for people, all with the intention, not charging or anything, all with the intention of just getting someone to say like, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. And the question people have asked me over the years is like, well, why did you do that kind of effort rather than just kind of reading what others have said about it? And this is where it's interesting in my background. So having pursuing a degree in African American studies conditioned me not to trust secondary sources because I'm like, well, you know,
Who wrote this? Who said
who wrote
this? Yeah,
this?
who wrote
White
history?
men have lied
Mhm.
about
Everything.
the
And
constructions of race and what they mean. So how can I trust that? I was more inclined to do the research myself, which
mhm.
I'm glad I did because I think most skeptics I've encountered are lazy. They haven't done the research themselves or the readings. Because if they had, one, they would have far better questions and far better ammunition if they wanted to have that. Um, and I think rather than relying on someone else's misunderstandings, because most when I do read skeptics and I read their papers, they don't know astrology. It's like,
It's really frustrating. It is.
yeah,
It
they
is.
don't they actually haven't studied it, or they're like, oh, I'm just looking at the 12 signs, and I'm like, that's not astrology. That's not even what we do. That's your understanding of it, and it's very limited.
Right,
So that's
right.
my journey. It was to shut up a Gemini,
I
and that's kind of
love
how it.
love that that idea of like you needed to debunk it yourself because you needed to prove it. And so you're not a lazy skeptic,
Mm-mm.
a hardworking skeptic, a
Well,
thorough
I had to
skeptic.
understand it. I had to understand it, just like I endeavored with religion. You know, I was studying some Greek, and I had like books, commentary and understanding the Bible.
Hmm.
This is where I guess the Scorpio Sun Mercury really does serve me in the sense in my Jupiter and Virgo, signifying that I want to look beneath the surface to understand what we're talking about. Um, but at the same time, it was hard for me to believe.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty particular and it's pretty specific to your journey. And so tell me something at that moment you start reading the books. Do you remember what book it was that
Oh yeah, the only way. So the books she had were the only ways to learn astrology by Miriam March and McEvers. I'm
okay.
blanking on. Yeah, so it's the only way. So there's a whole series of books they did, maybe 4 or 5 on the only way to learn astrology.
Mm-hmm.
Um, then I got on my own Parker's Astrology,
Mm-hmm.
and then I also got the Astrologer's Handbook. That was one of my earlier books. Last names are Sequoian and Acker.
Mm-hmm.
I'm blanking on the first names. And then the other book I had, which was a very frustrating book for me because it was so deterministic, um, was How to Be a Great Astrologer by James Braha. And that's because he's Vedic. And so
Oh,
he was also putting in some of his Vedic sensibilities. Um, I would be kinder to that now to some degree, but at the time it was just like, why is this so hard? But that was among my few books at the time in terms of looking at aspects and things like that. And I know now that that book, the title was tongue in cheek, completely, somewhat. It wasn't just like, well, I'm a great astrologer, so this
right.
is
Right. It's more like how to not be an awful astrologer. You know,
right.
right? I wish like books would be like that, like how to not be the worst astrologer. Um, that's like the
Yeah, I
title
mean,
of a
and
book.
one of my least favorite books, and I know I'm going to piss some people off, but hey, um, is the Joanne Woolfolk book, which is the only astrology book you ever need.
Oh, right, right. Yeah, it's not great.
No,
Sorry for that book.
it's
A lot of people own it, but it's not great.
no,
I
it's my
agree.
least favorite astrology book.
For beginners, yeah, those
Yeah.
foundational books that are around, yeah, that's like literally like not the best. And so when did you get an astrology teacher? Who's your teacher? When you
So let's talk
started
about
like
lineage.
learning, yeah, lineage, who did you start learning from, like
So
serious
for
learning?
10 years, from 1991 or so to 2000, maybe 9 years, while I was in Philadelphia, I only had books to kind of rely on. I didn't have any live teachers. Um, and this is before I knew about conferences and videos. And I mean, it is I won't say the pre-internet stage because the internet has actually been around since the 60s, but it's the pre-world WWW stage, the World Wide
Mm-hmm.
Web. So I moved to New York, and a girlfriend at the time was encouraging me to kind of, do more with astrology, maybe even not just study it, but maybe even make more of a practice out of it. And because I had gotten to the point where I believed in it. And so that's when I learned about conferences and teachers. So I went to my first astrology conference in New York. It was a smaller conference. And that's when I met Robert Zoller. And Robert Zoller became not directly a teacher because I was relying on his video, no, his recordings and um I guess a book that he had put together on the fundamentals. And it was more classical, traditional medieval astrology. I had gotten frustrated. Interestingly enough, it was at the point where I was almost walking away from astrology because I gotten frustrated with psychological astrology. I was like, are you guys just going to parrot Jung and Freud? Do you have some original thoughts related to things in terms of how you do things, or how astrology works? Like, what is this? And so he came at the right moment. And so he became like a distant teacher. And then I sought out a teacher, a live teacher, Julian Armistead, who's no longer with us. Um, and he was kind of a patrician Upper West Side type. Excuse me.
Bless you.
Um, when I say patrician Upper West Side type, if for those who don't know New York, kind of, like the kind who would wear ascot, white guy who's kind of like prim, very prim and proper, almost British but not British, right? And kind of picky, because when I was booking the appointment, he said, "Young man, I don't hear any rustling of paper to indicate that you're looking through an ephemeris to know when is an auspicious time for us to meet. No, I just need to figure out when to meet according to my schedule." That's what I said to him, because I was like, "What? What are you talking about?" So we did arrange a time to meet, and it was a life-changing meeting, not because he became my teacher per se, but I was asking him to teach me about rectification, and he's like, "Well, do you know such and such?" No. Do you know how to do XYZ? No. Have you gotten a certification through NCGR or taken exams? No. Like I didn't even know one needed to do that. Then he said the thing that kind of really helped change my life and trajectory in astrology. He said, "Well, then I don't know what you don't know." Now, my moon in Leo bristled because it's like, what the fuck you mean? You don't know what I don't know, right? Like
I know what I
I've been
know.
studying, right? I know I've been studying this for 10 years. I know a lot. But it did prompt me, I guess my Scorpio sun reflecting the light of that sun, I mean that moon. My Scorpio sun was like, well, what don't we know? Right. And so then I looked into the certification process. I was like, oh, clearly there's a lot I don't know. And
Right.
that's when I went through the process, studying with John Marcusella, Mark Woltz. Um, and then I found Alan Oken. So I studied esoteric astrology. I don't know if that would be a big surprise for you. I studied esoteric astrology
It's
for a
a
while.
little bit of a surprise, but I'm going to tell you, Alan Oken's name has been around. I'm not surprised to hear his name come now. And
Okay.
he's changed my life. I mean, I'm so sad that I won't get to meet him because he's changed my life as an astrologer multiple times.
Oh, well, that's
Yeah.
something for
So
us
I'm
to
not
talk about at some time.
surprised. I'm not surprised when he shows up in a conversation with somebody I respect. I'm like, of course, Alan touched this, you know?
So I studied with him in person, first in New
Um,
York.
and in Bali as
Um,
well.
hmm?
In Bali, did you go with
No,
him
no,
as
no, no.
well?
Here's the thing. So in New York, and then he invited us, or not just me, but others who were in his, under his tutelage, to come to Santa Fe for a week-long seminar, or it wasn't exactly a conference, where he was bringing in other astrologers to talk in local astrologers like Ariel Gutman. That's where I met her. Heather Roan Robbins. That's when I met her, and some others. Marcia Stark, who I don't know if you know, who also was more into medical astrology. Um, and to really be introduced to different realms of astrology for a whole week. So that's how I learned about Santa Fe. And that's how I first came here. So now I've come back, but that was because of my first encounter, thanks to Alan Oken, because he lived here. So he was
Mhm.
living here at the time. So, um, I studied that, then uh kind of hit a wall with esoteric astrology, um, kind of went back to traditional while simultaneously, still exploring some dimensions of modern, going through my certifications or having finished my certifications with NCGR. And then that's how I got more on around 2008, 2009, I got on the conference circuit and introduced into that community, and then got to more conferences, with SOTA, thanks to Donna Von Toen, um, out around in, Ontario, um, and then in Buffalo. And then from there it became ESAR, and then it became NORWAC. And with NORWAC, it also became the work of diversity scholarships and trying to diversify more of the community.
Yeah, you've received an award from from ESAR, right? For
Community service.
community service. Yeah, that's what I remember. It was an amazing speech that you gave.
Thank
It
you.
was really great. It was a good conference. ESAR 2022, wasn't it? It was really
Yeah,
great.
it was.
It
It
was
was my
really great.
last year as a board member.
Oh yeah, yeah. Much drama ensued after you left.
Oh, I know.
Just like
Well, without going too deep into it, it saddens me to see how much ESAR has gone through. Um, I think the ship is getting righted, but I think, the organizations themselves, speaking of existential crises, um, which I picked up and said, aloud in meetings when I first got into them in 2014 or got into ESAR. Well, actually, it was 2013. Um, I was like, why do folks need you? Like, are you really kind of proving your sense of need? Or are you just going and operating, on foundations that are now antiquated, you know? And I think it's taken them some time to kind of figure this out. I mean, this is why I'm also involved in a new organization, because ESAR, for instance, um, started wanting to charge the schools, for being ESAR affiliates. We're like, but you need us. Why are you charging us? What kind of kind of a mafia-esque kind of shit is this? So the schools bristled, and that was the head, of one of the schools in terms of the board. And we're like, well, we need to kind of focus more on educators. And so that's how the coalition came about. Eventually, now it's even along a certain trajectory of trying to bring together educators, not just in terms of institutions, but individuals as well, to kind of create standards that, will make it easier for someone who like develops a competency in horary to be able to leverage that to go either to another institution, or say that I have this competency in horary that they can use towards certification with ESAR or use with NCGR, rather than right now, you have to kind of go to each one with hat in hand and say, well, I've done this. Okay, well, now prove it to us. Okay, well, I've done this, and trying to create more of a universal standard.
right. I think that's like a really needed thing in our community right now. So the moment is like really ripe for it. I
Mm-hmm.
think that certifications are undergoing like some form of like we don't know what they translate to. What does it mean to be ESAR CAP certified or OPA certified or NCGR certified or like all of the Kepler like we need like a standard to understand each other and a common language.
Yeah, and then like we can cross fertilize with each other
Mm-hmm.
rather than seeming at odds. Because I have an NCGR level 3, and if I got NCGR level 4, it still doesn't count toward ESAR cap, still doesn't count toward an OPA certification. They are all in their silos, and rather than where we can kind of commingle.
Right. And they do commingle IRL. IRL, these are the teachers teach for everything. There's like very much a natural, like even friendship, I find between, like you don't find like, oh, it's Opa versus Isar. Like, no, people love each other.
No.
They speak to one another. They're friends. They've taught together. They know each other for 30 years. It's like, nope, there, you know what? Yeah, there needs to be more.
Yeah.
It's a funny happening. So I think it's really brilliant that you decided to do that. And so you're doing that with MJ Patterson, whom I love. So you're the president and she's the vice president.
She's the vice president, and then I'm also doing this with um Donna Young, who
Donna
also is
Young, who is the
who's been
president of
involved with Kepler.
Kepler.
She's the president of Kepler, and Carol Tebbs. A lot, Kara McCauley, a lot of people, and Enid Newberg, who was also one of the founders for Kepler. A lot of people who've been in astrological education.
Yeah, and who understand their needs. So
Hmm.
that's really, really great. And so can you tell me a little bit about your practice now? So I know I've come to you both as a teacher and astrologer. So I know that you do see clients. Is that what would you say is like your percentage? Are you more teacher, more, do you more see one-on-one clients, or
It
is it
depends on
half
the time of
half?
year.
Okay.
So pretty much from late spring or early summer through the summer, I'm mainly subsisting off of consultations. And then when it goes into the fall and the winter and then early spring, I'm teaching. And I'm either teaching, a course with an institution, like I'll be teaching for Kepler come the fall, but I also will have two of my own courses. So I will have a bigger transition to mainly teaching and maybe even having some private mentees or students, and then having some time for consultations. Um, so I don't know if I can give a percentage, but that kind of gives you some sense of, how things usually flow during my year. I'm
Hmm.
always seeing clients during the year, but it will vary because, you know, the intensity, especially, teaching a course and having, when you're teaching for an institution, and also for myself, you're also grading, right? Because I
Hmm.
do grade. I do believe in, when I say grade, it may not always be with a literal grade, but feedback. Even when I have a TA who does the first foray and gives a lot more detail, I always look at the papers as well.
Hmm.
Um, and especially with the beginners class. And there's even more I'm looking to do with the next iteration of my classes. Um, More discussions about the readings, because I have readings, but I don't always discuss them, and I'm gonna do better with that. Because there are a lot more tools that are available now if you kind of use things like circle.so or Mighty Networks. You can create your own Facebook, and so it can be a lot more interactive, creating a community of learning, which is what I love. Um, so there's a lot more I can do with that, and that's going to take more time. So I may not have as much time for consulting.
Hmm. And okay, can you tell me a little bit about your consultations? Like, is there like a common thread or like a theme or something that you feel like you're particularly like the guy to go to for, or a way that your clients, and so that for me, that varies sometimes through periods. Like all of my clients are going to come and they're going to be a special way in a period of my life, like very much like a mirror. Does that happen to you too? Like you'll have like
Well,
a,
yeah, I mean, especially with natal, it used to happen a lot more in the past. It doesn't happen as much now.
right,
And I don't know if I'm insulated by age or insulated a certain way by
experience.
status,
Mm,
experience,
yeah,
but it used to happen a lot more. Now it can be more independent themes where I'm seeing like in a day, oh, you all have Moon and Gemini, right? Or you
yeah,
all have this. So it's not, but it used to be like, I used to talk about it as Quantum Leap. I don't know if you remember that series,
yeah.
the original, where I would seem like I leap into someone's life and like it's the exact lesson I'm dealing with at that particular moment. Um, and so, but that doesn't happen the same way like as it used to in terms of method. So, and or specializations. I would say I specialize related to natal, electional, horary, astrocartography, and synastry. Those are like my 5 key things that I can do at any given point related to a consultation. Most people come to me related to natal, and then from that, predictive, meaning like, well, what's happening over the next few months or years. Then, in terms of techniques that I rely on, I look at perfection, solar returns, secondary progressions, and then there's Fedaria, there's zodiacal releasing, and let me see if there's anything else. Oh, solar arc directions are
Mm-hmm.
also something I will pay attention to. But that's pretty much it, starting with my big 3: perfection, solar returns, and progressions. But then Fedaria,
Those are your basic like bread and butter.
that's what I look at for every chart, whether it's 30 minutes or an hour. Now, what am I doing? Well, this is where I always kind of joke that in the parallel universe, I'm a lawyer. Or parallel universes. There's probably many Sam Reynolds who are lawyers.
Lawyers are definitely one. I see it. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's definitely this permutation. There's other things too.
Devil's
A criminal,
advocate.
a criminal, all kinds of other things, right? And I like that
Yeah.
idea and that mythology. But what I'm doing is I'm looking at, each of these techniques as witnesses and evidence that testify along a certain theme in constructing a story about what is happening in this person's life. So the windows that open toward peak periods, either at level 1, 2, or 3, I don't pay attention as much to level 4.
Mm-hmm.
If you guys know zodiacal releasing, at those levels, I get a picture of like where this person is landing, and then the progressions matched with the transits and eclipses will give me like, oh, this is definitely happening related to this particular, you know, part of this person's life. But then I also, will ask, because I believe, even though there's still some lasting doubt about our degree of agency, I do believe that it's useful to believe that we act a certain way or can take action a certain way. So I focus on, well, what can you do or what do you want to do? So if they were going toward a particular peak period and they're like, well, are you looking to move? Are you looking to kind of, go into another job or, ask for a raise or whatever? And if they say yes, then I could talk about here's particular periods that are auspicious for you. Rather than like, well, let's just twiddle our thumbs and, conjecture about what's going to be happening in your life. Because I don't like to do that. For a lot of different reasons. I mean, sometimes, a lot of people who come to us are anxious. So one of the things I'm committed to not doing is creating more anxiety. So for instance, let's say someone is in a window where I see like there's some challenges that could be related to someone's death, not theirs necessarily. And they kind of have said to me like, well, I'm taking care of my ailing mother. This is not something I'm going to talk about with them in that direct way. I'm not going to say like, well, this could be a time when your mom could pass.
She's dying in
Because I'm like,
3 years. Yeah.
it's kind of like, why would I do that? Even if it's say for the sake of argument was is true. Well, you don't know if it's absolute truth. What you know is that this could be a window for that. So what I focus in on, or what I will say, is like, this is a time where, it might be a very good time to spend more time and be conscientious and attentive to your mom in terms of doing particular things with her, or kind of do the work of forgiveness and healing with each other. What becomes the thing that one can do that becomes most beneficial? Talking about someone dying doesn't necessarily give that window, just creates an anxiety. And I actually, done this with some clients, um and some have been really grateful. Like I did it with one particular client um whose husband did die suddenly, and who was having an affair, that she didn't know. But the work that she did with her husband during that time, she, I guess, is always grateful for. So these are the things that we can we can do to allay anxiety rather than increase it. But it seems that astrologers have gotten into this habit, whether they're doing like pop astrology or kind of just, going on IG Live or whatever, and stoking anxiety. Okay, here we go with the Mercury retrograde. This probably is going to be one of the biggest ones yet. It's it, why? Or this full moon is at 29 degrees. So that's a final degree. So this may be where things may be closing for you. And I'm like, closing for who?
For who?
How? So some measure of this skeptic. Now I think of myself as still more like an in-house skeptic. Still is with me because it's like, but more not of astrology, but of
Of the
astrologers,
bullshit.
right? Because I'm
I
like,
mean,
I know what you're saying and I know why you're saying it, but does it work? Is it true? And is it universally true? Because I think that's the kind of the problem where we've kind of lapsed into this idea of, just kind of focusing on transits and saying, well, this is what's happening. And I'm like, well, for who? I mean, it could be for you. Um, and then how do we talk about this? Because it can lead to carelessness, not just in terms of the way I described, but carelessness in terms of bordering on nonsensical. So people will say, like, well, this full moon is really going to be important because this is like another step in our evolution of our consciousness. And I just feel like, chick, we've been the same for about 10,000 years.
or if this full moon is a step in our conscious of evolution, then every full moon has been and will forever be a
Me, right.
step into the evolution of our planetary consciousness. Yes.
Yes. And I'm like, don't you get sick of that? Do you think that's true?
And then
Right? Have you
yeah,
been critical of that yourself? And I
I
don't think many have. Yeah, but go
I
on.
can't deal with transit astrology. I mean, I'm yeah, I don't know if it's from the same angle as you exactly, but it's the same thought that number one, like for whom? Who are we talking to? I'm really much about, like I know that the transits will affect some people. Like this last Mars Uranus conjunction was on my sun and moon. I have sun, moon at 25, sun at 26. So I was like, oh, once in a lifetime, beautiful. That morning I told my husband I wasn't gonna drive. But the day happened and I needed to drive. So I said to myself, Sarah, don't be a superstitious, crazy person. Okay. So many things can happen. So many things can happen. I drove so carefully and I was at a stop sign, stopped, and I got rear-ended. It's
Ya no lo creo.
I
Wow.
and so I laughed, and I thought, oh my God, like how on the nose and silly and what a wink. And but because I'm not superstitious of transits, but this one was so particular for me, Sarah, yes. So if you had your sun and your moon at 25 and 26 degrees of Taurus, yes, possibly, or
Or
possibly could
square.
not, or
Right.
square, or not, or who knows, maybe it's so subtle you're not seeing it, maybe who knows. It doesn't have to be like so
On the nose.
so, but I have a tendency to roll my eyes at generalities and commonalities just so, and superstition just like doesn't vibe with me. So I pushed myself to drive because I was calling out my own bullshit, but then it wasn't. Bullshit.
But I think that's important work to do in the sense that, it could have manifested in other ways while you were at home, right?
With a
Like
knife, God
a
forbid.
knife or, getting on
Yeah,
a ladder and then
and
you kind of
trip and fall in the stairs.
it could be any
Who
number of
knows?
things. And this is why I tell people it's like where I emphasize some degree of agency, like, well, like the example I might give for Mars, in your case, I would be like, don't try to rush through the yellow light, right? Now, again, you
Right,
can't.
exactly. So you can't live your life like this, and it can't be true for everybody. And part of my work with astrology is also observing rather than preemptively anxiety, all of that. Like I'm trying to like just be in the moment and use it maybe in the moment if it's useful for me. But that's
That's
yeah.
exactly right. To be in
But
the moment. So that's kind of my challenge with the CNN of astrology right now, because people
right.
seem to treat the transits like CNN and everything becomes a headline, um,
And diluted and
and
diluted,
diluted.
very watered down. And so it loses kind of its like actual power, its actual force when we
Yeah, people
dilute
lose
it
their
too.
power too. And people lose their power. So it's not necessarily helping them with the specificity of a chart like we were just talking about. And it's not, it's kind of looking to the astrologer like, well, give us guidance. Well, I'm like, well, are you listening to yourself? Are you also listening to your past? The past is prologue in some sense of getting some sense of, okay, well, Mars Uranus, when there was a square, what
Exactly.
happened? Or
Exactly.
the opposition, what was kind of emphasized. You can get clues. I call it Nyctanastic horoscopes when you're kind of reflecting
That's
on
that
what
that's
on
one
the
of my
past.
favorite techniques whenever I see a transit, whenever I see even an aspect natally in a chart, is to track it and to see what happens in these moments and to kind of see the patterns and make it more personal to the person. But for what's going on right now with transits on the internet, because we were kind of like brushing about that before we started to talk, it's for me, I don't feel like it contributes to the dialogue. I feel like maybe it even cheapens it, and I don't want to add to the noise of anxiety attachment with the people. Tell me what's going to happen. Is that good for me? Is that not good for me? That kind of like little tension for me defeats the purpose of what astrology can bring to people.
I know, and I get it. I mean, some people are hooked into it that way, or I say some astrologers are hooked into that way. It sells, right? It's a way to kind of build your business. But I think it's a dangerous way to build your business because not only in terms of anxiety with people, it's kind of like a gaping maw, meaning that it will devour you because you feel the need. And I've seen it happen to many young astrologers or newer astrologers where the need to constantly create content either leads to compromises in integrity where you're like, stealing from other people in order to kind of fulfill your content deadlines, or you're saying things you don't even fully mean or know enough about in order to kind of, keep the content wheel going.
Yeah, the
Um,
content mill. Yeah.
mhm.
Yeah, it feels a little bit for me, it's very counterintuitive also as a Taurus. Like I need a lot more time to process and digest information before I'm ready to, like share or produce something, But that's really, really interesting, this idea of like compromising the integrity of the craft by doing so also, like
Mhm.
it makes astrology and astrologers look a certain way, and it creates this idea that we are part of like this issue of like this anxiety that's going on, like, oh, Mercury retrograde, so funny.
Yeah, and it kind of, yeah. So I think we've exhausted that sense, but that's kind of more my recoil from doing that. And I've participated in it. I'm not going to say I'm guiltless in it.
No, because it's also fun to watch the news with astrology as a companion. Like we could not though.
Mhm.
You can't not, as an astrologer, watch the news and not make the correlations. It's impossible. Like our brains, can you shut it down? Can you shut down? You can't shut down your knowledge of, the planets where they are today and correlating it to the events of the day. It's impossible.
Yeah, but I think we need to have the honesty, the integrity, and maybe even some measure of the humility to know that we don't know exactly how these things will go. Um, so people are going like, well, no, this person is going to win because of this and their transits, and this person's going to win. And kind of going with these particular ideas
And
of,
they usually all have particular transits on the election too, because guess
yeah,
what? They're still running, so shit is
that's
going
right.
down for them. So when we're looking at like even Joe Biden or Harris or Trump's chart, like they're all super active. There's no way of knowing who's crazy transits, or but because they're all going through crazy
Right, or
times.
what that might mean. It could be
Right.
like someone has a granddaughter. or, you know, they,
Change
you
of
know,
status. Yeah. Change of status. Honor you become. Yeah.
right?
That's very interesting. And so, okay, so tell me, like, apart from that, like your relationship as an astrologer, like giving astrology. So you give it to the people, you teach it to your students. You really, what I appreciate for you as a teacher is like your commitment to excellence. And I find that you speak to your students like they're intelligent people. And
Hmm.
I really appreciate that from you when I sit in your class to be like spoken to um like an intelligent person, like not down, you know what I mean? Like you really give excellence. But what does so that's how you give astrology. I want to know what astrology gives you, like in your life. Like, do you find, is it like a spiritual practice? I know you're practicing Muslim. How do you, how does astrology like enrich your own personal life, your spiritual practices, your beliefs, your relationship with the unseen? Can you touch on that for a
So
second?
that is probably the key place to start the relationship to the unseen, because the image that I have related to my life, there's two ways I can frame it. One is from a movie, which I'll happily share, and the other way is just an image related to what you just said, the relationship to the unseen. Like, and I'll do it. Um, I usually do it on the a table or something, but I'll do it this way. There's the image of, even going back to how I felt as a child, that there is something. Oops, I didn't mean to hit the mic, but there's something I'm trying to not even just catch, but put my hand on or grasp. Maybe that's even a better way to do it. To grasp, that is elusive, and it is the unmanifest, the other unseen. And astrology is one powerful way by which to do that. Obviously, tarot can do that. You know, in religion, like in Islam, when we do the prayers, it's a moment of honoring the movement and the mystery, or the movement of the mystery. You know, in terms of what we may say, but it's a moment of repose in honoring it. So that is where I live, you know, trying to not just to, it's trying to like grasp this movement that I've always felt is happening. The movie is Superman, and it's not Superman himself, right? It's one particular moment where Air Force One um is going down because it's been hit by lightning, and um the pilots are freaking out, and Superman comes up, you know, we see him on the screen, and you know,
I
starts
remember that's the
writing the
scene of
craft.
life.
But it's what this one of the pilots says to the other one, because he the pilot says, "What the hell happened? Everything is normal." And the other guy says, "Fly. We've got something. I ain't saying what, but just trust me. Fly." And that's how I feel like life is. Like, I don't know what this is, you know, whether you want to call it God, karma, Atman, Allah, whatever, it's something that we are trying to grasp. And astrology is one way, especially over the last 2,000 years, that, and using something visible that we all can see, that we try to grasp and understanding. And I find it very useful in that way, in terms of going and using the word apprehension, right? To apprehend this and understand at the same time and comprehend. You know, the Romans had great words, the Latin, does grasp it in that sense of, diving and looking at something. So that's what astrology is for me. That's one of the things it gives me. Um, it's one way in which I've been able to fulfill my North Node in Aries in the second house, being entrepreneurial, having something that is more of my own, based on the nature of my Mars, which rules my ninth house sun. Um, in terms of being able to live out, this pursuit, um, that I never get tired of, because, it's all around me. Now, the ways in which it's manifested or how I encounter it change, you know, whether that's been through Christianity or through Islam or whatever, it's still recognizing that there's something, just fly. Don't look. Because even if I looked, I wouldn't know what I'm looking at. And that was actually a very good point to say to the pilot, because even if you saw it, your mind would fry to some degree, because I'm like, there's a man holding a wing up. And I really thought that was, even when I was a kid, that was a profound moment because, as much as we were used to Superman, they really kind of punched up the fact, like, what would happen if we saw someone doing what we thought was impossible or not even conceivable? And I think that's kind of the beauty I see related to astrology. Because, we have those moments where people, how do you know that? Like even that moment where for me with the astrologer kind of having that divinatory moment, like this Mercury moon means this. It's not something I would have said. I've gone to other astrologers.
They haven't said it,
They
right?
haven't said it.
You
And,
gotta
and that,
hit. There's moments where you'll see things, you'll put them together. It's a lot of like cooking, right? It
mhm.
feels like astrology. You're taking ingredients, you're missing them, and you kind of taste and be like, oh, it tastes like your mother and your brother and your father were in an argument that caused da 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 da. And you're like, how did you come up with that? But it's just the
Boom.
creativity of it. Right. And sometimes we do hit and those moments when I will hit something so precise, I'll look back and be like, how did I know?
Right. And it's amazing. I mean, that's what it feeds. Um, you know, you might say, well, what are the challenges? Because that's also, the hard part. Well, there's a good amount of our population that doesn't take us seriously.
Hmm.
Um, for self-inflicted reasons and some reasons that have nothing to do with us.
Hmm.
I think that's sometimes hard. Um, I think
Hmm.
one of the things that you mature into, and I definitely have been maturing, is you get away from trying to find the absolute right way to
Right.
realizing that there are multiple ways in which to do it. I think there are some wrong ways for some things, but even in those moments where someone may get something right, they may do it in some unconventional way, um, or some other way that may not make sense to you. And so you just have to leave space for the mystery. Um, and it took me a while to learn to respect that because I would say like, no, that's dumb, right? I would be that guy, literally, like, no, that's not right. Blah blah. I've learned to do that less. I mean, I still do it. I have my moments, but even when I'm doing it, some measure, especially with students, is to be provocative to get them to think. Like, why do you think that's true? And what I've learned in that method, and pushing some students that way, is more so not because I think I'm convinced that I'm right. It's more like I want you to know why you are right. Why do you believe what you believe? Because it's I don't want you to just say like, well, my teacher taught it this way, or it taught me this way. But how do you know that's true? The skeptic still comes up, right? The Jupiter and Virgo opposing the ascendant. It's like, you know, it's I always say like it's like the serpent in the Bible who says to Eve, "Yea, hath God said." Yeah, is that true? So that Jupiter is kind of like, yeah, but how do you know? And that always seems like an invite to kind of like, well, just embrace doubt. No, it's kind of to use doubt to get more towards certainty.
Yeah, and to do that Scorpio thing that you were saying, like, okay, don't be a lazy skeptic. Like, go for it. Like,
Go
prove
for it.
yourself right. Like, do that thing fully. Right.
Do the damn thing. Don't just be like half-assed about it. Like, well, how do you know? Because I think the biggest disappointment I've experienced in astrology is that a lot of people believe things without having evaluated them or even fully owned them, in terms of how they believe and what they believe. Well, that's just your karma. Have you studied karma? I mean, like, really, do you know there are like at least on the basic level, like five different levels and ideas of karma? You know, um, is that why are you using that if that's not even your historical tradition, right? Questions. Again, that doesn't mean you can't, but why? And that's why I say with my class is know your why. Know your why.
Yeah, there's also the problem. I mean, the problem, I don't know that it's a real problem, but to your point, like people who study half-ass or, just brush lightly on things, understand concepts barely, or just have a shallow understanding of like very deep concepts, and then they go out and be professional astrologers and give readings that could be potentially dangerous actually when left in the hands of somebody who's careless, or who doesn't know. And so do you find that you have like some form of, I think there's like a healthy dose of gatekeeping, maybe. Like, okay, there is a certain, like, do you think that there's a certain level of education, maybe, or some things like basics that you should know? I spoke to once to Jessica Lanyado, and she was like, you need to learn how to draw a chart by hand. Like for her, if you don't know how to draw a chart by hand, that's it. It's over. I mean, not in these words literally, but something like that. Like, do you find yourself a little bit maybe more strict when it comes to education, you having been in like so many schools and taught so much?
Well, I mean, I use the Socratic method in terms of questions. So, for instance, like what's been interesting is to kind of see, thanks to people's free exposure to Hellenistic astrology, largely due to Chris Brennan, which I think is a great thing. But some people kind of come in and I know why they come and study with me, where they haven't fully digested the things that they're learning. So they'll say, like, well, Mercury's in his chariot. And I'm the guy who goes, like, the fuck does that mean? Now I know what it means, right? I know what they're saying, but like, how do you talk to people? Because there's this movement one has as a student where you are learning the concepts for yourself. And then there is the movement where you're also learning the concept related to talking to others about it so that it makes sense. I always say to my students, speaking to the idea of someone around the way, like in your hood, Pookie, like you're speaking to Pookie, who's intelligent, but not necessarily educated, or if educated, not in the way that you have experienced your astrological education. So you have to be able to explain it in a way that Pookie can understand. Um, so to say like, oh, Mercury's in the chariot, it's by virtue of the same sign in its relationship to the sun, or it's kind of one of its domiciles at home, chilling. To be able to have a way to be able to talk about that it's that's accessible, rather than, and this is why I do find astrologers do, and you were kind of alluding to that, and I appreciate the kind words you said to me. It's kind of like where astrologers become much more insular and rarefied in their language and talking about things um, without breaking things down. And I have Twitter to thank for that, because Twitter, from I got on Twitter in 2009. And so when I first got on and talked about astrology, and people were so excited to be on Twitter in the early days that they were really like, everything was a good conversation. And I had more time, and so I would spend more time on Twitter. And so if I said like, "Oh, it's a full moon," people would ask like, "What's that mean for Libra?" And it was kind of a shock for me. I'm like, "Why are we talking about Libra?" Because the person was a Libra, right? And I was like, "Oh, so I have to kind of, angle things a certain way because people are thinking in relation to themselves and not just knowledge for its own sake, right?" And then I started seeing the mistakes other astrologers would make, like, "Well, we're going toward a void moon." What the fuck is a void moon? And what does that mean? Right? And I had to work on breaking things down. you may notice I don't teach as much on Twitter. So to your question about gatekeeping, there's more, well, one, there are more people who are doing it, whether they're really able or not, but there's a good number of people who are doing more. But, I think it's kind of more where you want to draw people in. So I focus more on my classes where there could be more of an intimate community and a setting to kind of learn these things rather than just throwing out things in public, because you can't check those things. You can't, see how people really are absorbing those things, and then they may weaponize them. A lot of people weaponize astrology.
They do, yeah. Yeah, for themselves, for their
Their exes or
the Capricorn.
the current partner or their, parents or children. They weaponize it. Like they learn of a lot of fortune and it's like, oh, there's a lot of fortune is here. So this, I'm gonna do this, and then they learn magic or then they want to, create talismans and not, the more I've studied astrology, the more I've also kind of realized that it's also character building. It's kind of looking at the recesses of your character, whether you want to deem them good or bad, and how you are developing that and how you become conscious of it. Not to just give license to it. Oh, you have a bad temper. So does that give you license just to consistently have a bad temper? Or does that give you license to kind of work on your temper?
Hmm.
I
I
think the latter.
Right. I think of what you're talking about, like how I would sum it up, would say that it's like a client-based approach. Like it's really mindful of the way this is going to be received. That it's
Hmm.
more about the usefulness or how this thing that you're putting out, why are you putting this out? Why are you saying it? Who are you saying it to? And the importance of that exchange. What I'm hearing, even when we're talking about the, tweeting about transits or in readings, what do we do about like the anxiety that it can give? Or now when you're talking about this, like I hear the importance of caring about how it's received. So the gentleness in your practice, like to make sure that this may be powerful, may be dangerous if used, carelessly, that you really intend it to be to land gently on the person. Is that right?
You almost brought me to tears. And I'll tell you why. And then maybe this, I know we're going toward the end. I do have to
Yeah.
end soon, but you also wanted to talk about the ascendant. So I'm a Pisces rising. And why that really resonated, and I felt that, is one of the early motivators, I guess, going toward this shift, moving from the Jupiter and Virgo side of just analyzing it to more what Jupiter rules, that Pisces side, is realizing how many people are suffering and the suffering that people endure, you know, not just in the visible ways, but the calamity that people may feel like 1 o'clock in the morning, or when they walk in their room. When you grow up with a disability, you become sensitized, in some ways desensitized in other ways, but you become sensitized to how people move in the world. you know if you observe people who experience some measure of bodily harm, like breaking their legs or whatever, you can see it in their manner, in terms of how they're speaking in the actor's studio, observing body language. If you had to embody Richard III, you would at the same time be casting spell of the vulnerability he feels with the anger and then the need for invulnerability that comes alive. And so people wear this on themselves. And in that, they go through a lot of suffering. And if astrology, if prayer, if any kind of spiritual work does not allay human suffering, I don't see the point of it. I will despise it. And I think that is the real work of this work, to allay human suffering, because people are suffering. I mean, I stopped being friends with an astrologer when he was talking about, how he um how people basically, how he was right about, things. And I asked him, like, well, if, because he was talking about, okay, he made the argument that during Obama's presidency that there was going to be something he called Obamageddon, and basically that there would be economic destruction. So in 2016, when it became apparent that it hadn't happened, I said, well, if it had happened and you were right, what would you have said to these people? And he said they should have listened to me. And in that moment, I was like, I'm fucking done with you. And I was. And I told him why. And I was like, I spelled out, like, don't talk to me because I'm your enemy. Because what I believe in is, if you are not doing the work of allaying human suffering, you're the devil. I don't mean that literally.
But I understand what you mean, because there's inherently this power structure with the astrologer that has the answer and the person that has the questions.
Mm-hmm.
And so if your point as an astrologer is to be right, we're fucked.
Right. So that is not my perspective. I do not need to be absolutely right. I just need to be absolutely righteous, in the sense of caring for people. Even if I'm wrong, I still cared.
That's
And
really beautiful. That's really beautiful, and that's really spoken like a true Pisces rising. And I can really feel it on all over your practice and the way that you are with your students. And as somebody who's received readings from you, also like really always gentle and caring, and this intention um, is really central. Um,
thank you for seeing me. I mean, that felt seen by that, because I was like, yeah, that is the cornerstone of, you know, of how I see life to some degree. Like, yeah, I talked about the mystery, the moving, but if the nature of divinity is only for itself and not for humanity, and not for moving humanity forward and helping us, I don't see the point. I refuse to believe in a God who doesn't believe in humans.
it's deep. That's deep and true, and I feel that, yeah. Yeah, so it's interesting. You asked last time on Twitter, Threads, Instagram, everywhere about humanistic astrology. But that sentence, I refuse to believe in a God who doesn't believe in humans, that could be like the new humanistic astrologer's manifesto.
Or humanist. I see. I actually, when I was asking that, I'm writing a book,
You are? I'm so
and
excited.
yes,
About
I'm.
what?
Well, I'll get to that for sure. But I'm writing a book, and it's influenced heavily by a or two humanistic astrologers, Dane Rudger and
Love
Alexander
them.
Ruperti.
Yeah.
And Ruperti's book, especially, his Cycles of Becoming, is kind of a cornerstone related to this book, and so he's humanistic. But I would say I'm more along the spectrum of humanist astrologer. And like, well, what's the difference? Well, humanistic, the ick means that you are like something, right? You're like unto like a humanist. A humanist, and there's such a thing as a religious humanist, is kind of centering the human related to the story of divinity. And I it's wanting to center our human stories and our humanism, which is not just centering the metaphysics. So humanistic astrology is enamored and centering on the metaphysical, spirit, karma, all these particular terms. It's not that I disbelieve in them. I don't waste time in disbelieving. I just don't necessarily accept them. Like I said, I embrace the mystery. So I don't know. I'm not going to say whatever this movement is definitively karma or God or whatever. I just know there's a correlation in the movement of cycles that go along with what happens in human life, but I'm centering human life. So
Mm-hmm.
this is kind of like when I said that statement, and I haven't said it before, but it's so true that, I wouldn't believe in a God that doesn't believe in humans. It's because I center humans. Whereas it seems like sometimes in religion, whether you're talking about Islam or Judaism, is that there's more of a belief in God than humanity. And I don't. I'm not. I refuse to.
Right. And I think that your work really transpires that, and that it's beautiful to be an astrologer for you because you can really like put your hands like not physically on people, but
In their lives, talking about their lives. That's why it's
yeah, and
important for me to still
helping, and
consult.
it's like rolling up your sleeves and being of service and being there in the present moment with the people. It's very,
I look
very
at the
beautiful.
Taurus beholding the Scorpio. I feel seen. At the same time, I'm like,
Yes.
ah.
Must be too much. It's okay. It's okay. I found your
No,
face.
it's beautiful. It's beautiful. Thank you. It's a gift.
Thank you so much for being here, Sam. I don't want to prolong this too much. I think we've covered so much ground and I got to pick your brains and I'm really super grateful. I want to take a minute to thank all the people who brought you here. So I wrote Geneva the Gemini as our number one. Thank
Mm-hmm.
you, Geneva the Gemini. Thank you to Kofi and that amazing reading. I wrote Robert Zoller, Julien. I wrote Julien Amistad because I decided he was French in my head.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote Alan Oken as the teachers that brought you here. So I always want to like have some gratitude for the people who made you the astrologer that you are today. Thank you. You make me the astrologer that I am today. So I'm really grateful to consider you one of my mentors and to have had you today. So if anybody wants to find out more about Sam and his work, please go to his website, unlockastrology.com, and take all of his classes. You should. And we will read your book. Everyone will.
Inshallah. Okay, well, thank you.
Inshallah. Thank you so much, Sam.